Title: The Night Watcher's Whisper. Mark Stevens, a night shift security guard, has always been comfortable with solitude. The quiet of empty office buildings is where he finds peace. But things take a dark turn when he starts hearing whispers. At first he brushes it off, thinking it's just his mind playing tricks. But soon the voice becomes more persistent, more sinister, as it begins to taunt him and reveal dark secrets about the building, and about Mark himself. As the line between reality and the supernatural blurs, Mark is pulled into a terrifying ordeal that forces him to confront an ancient evil hiding in plain sight. Part 1. The First Whisper. Mark Stevens leaned back in his chair, the soft hum of fluorescent lights filling the quiet, empty building. It was his third month working the night shift at Greystone Tower, a corporate office complex that was dead silent after 9 p.m. He liked it this way. No coworkers, no bosses, just him and his thoughts. The pay was decent, and the work was simple. Monitor the cameras, patrol the floors, and make sure nothing was out of place. The first few weeks had been uneventful. A few flickering lights, the occasional mouse scurrying in the basement, but nothing he couldn't handle. His nights were spent drinking coffee, watching late-night television on his phone, and doing rounds through the deserted hallways. But tonight felt different. As he sat at his desk, eyes lazily watching the grainy CCTV footage, he felt it. A faint sensation crawling down his spine, like someone was watching him. He turned his head, scanning the shadows that clung to the corners of the security office. The building was still, empty. With a dismissive grunt, he got up to begin his rounds. Mark moved through the dimly lit corridors of the lower floors, the only sound being the soft tap of his boots on the polished tiles. He pulled out his flashlight, shining it into the dark corners of the hallway. As he reached the elevator, his radio crackled to life. "Mark." He froze. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, barely audible through the static. "Hello? Who's there?" he said into his radio, feeling a sudden tension in his chest. No response. The static persisted for a moment before cutting off entirely. He shook his head, trying to brush off the unease. Faulty equipment, probably just interference. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. As he stepped into the elevator to begin his rounds on the upper floors, the voice returned. "Mark, why are you here?" His blood ran cold. It wasn't his imagination this time. Someone was definitely speaking to him over the radio. He pressed the button to the 15th floor, staring at his reflection in the polished steel doors. The elevator rose with a soft hum. When the door slid open, the floor was dark, save for the emergency lights that gave off a faint orange glow. Mark's hand tightened on his flashlight as he stepped out. As he walked down the long hallway, he passed rows of glass offices. The building was always eerily quiet at night, but tonight it felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, like it was pressing in on him. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. "You shouldn't be here." Mark spun around, his flashlight scanning the empty hallway. His heart pounded in his chest as sweat beaded on his forehead. He grabbed the radio from his belt, his hand shaking slightly. "Who is this?" he barked into the radio. No answer. The static hissed for a moment before going silent again. "All right, fine," he muttered, trying to keep his nerves in check. "If someone's messing with me, I'm gonna find out." He started moving faster, his boots clicking sharply against the tiles. As he reached the end of the hall, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in one of the offices. He stopped, staring through the glass. Nothing. He shone his flashlight inside. The room was empty, just a desk and a few chairs. But for a brief second, he could have sworn he saw someone standing there, watching him. His radio crackled to life again. "You can't escape me." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The voice was close. Too close. It didn't sound like it was coming from the radio anymore. It sounded like it was coming from right behind him. He spun around, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. A chill ran down his spine as the building seemed to close in around him. He wasn't alone. Something was here. Something that shouldn't be. Mark hurried back to the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, always just on the edge of his hearing. "Mark, you won't leave!" When he reached the elevator, he slammed the button, desperate to get out of there. The doors slid open slowly and he stepped inside, frantically pressing the button for the ground floor. As the elevator doors began to close, he saw it, just for a split second, reflected in the polished metal. A shadow standing in the hallway, watching him. His heart skipped a beat, and he slammed his fist against the button, urging the elevator to move faster. When the doors finally closed, he leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The elevator began its descent, and Mark pressed his back against the cool steel, his hands trembling. Then, the lights went out. Complete darkness engulfed the elevator. His breath quickened as he fumbled for his flashlight, turning it on. The narrow beam of light did little to chase away the suffocating blackness. And then the voice returned, louder, clearer, as if someone was standing right next to him. "Mark, I see you." Part 2. The entity revealed. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. His flashlight beam trembled as he swept it across the elevator's walls, expecting something, anything to appear in the suffocating darkness. The voice was no longer distant or crackling through the radio. It felt real, like it was right there with him. "Who the hell are you?" Mark shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Silence. Then the elevator jolted to a stop. The sudden motion threw Mark off balance, and he stumbled, catching himself on the metal railing. The elevator wasn't moving anymore, trapped somewhere between the floors. He frantically pressed the button for the ground floor, but nothing happened. The buttons were unresponsive, as though the power had been completely cut. His breathing grew more rapid. He had been trained for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He pulled out his radio again. "This is Mark. Anyone there? I'm stuck in the elevator. Hello?" More static. But in the static, he heard it again. That voice. It was soft but growing stronger, more insistent. "Mark, you belong to me." Mark dropped the radio in panic, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. He slammed his fists against the elevator doors, trying to pry them open. The confined space felt like it was closing in on him. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and the cold, metallic smell of the elevator filled his nostrils. Then, the voice whispered something different. Something darker. "I've waited so long for you." Mark's blood froze. It was no longer a taunt, it was a promise. The voice had a deep, hollow tone to it now, filled with malicious intent. Suddenly, the temperature in the elevator plummeted. The warm, stale air gave way to an icy chill that sank into Mark's bones. He could see his breath, fogging up in the narrow beam of his flashlight. The light flickered for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then he saw it. A figure, dark, tall, and shadowy, standing at the far end of the elevator. It had no discernible features, just a formless black mass, like a void sucking all the light out of the air around it. But its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The flashlight flickered again, and the figure seemed to shift, edging closer. Mark backed into the corner, his chest tightening with sheer terror. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the thing in front of him. "What do you want from me?" His voice was barely a whisper now, shaky and weak. For a moment, there was no answer. The shadowy figure loomed, growing darker and denser as if feeding off his fear. Then, the voice spoke once more, low and echoing inside his head. "You are mine." The flashlight flickered violently and then went out, plunging Mark into complete darkness. In the pitch-black void of the elevator, he could feel the entity's presence looming closer, the air growing impossibly cold. His heart raced, pounding in his ears as the voice echoed around him, repeating those chilling words. In a blind panic, Mark pounded on the elevator doors again, screaming for help. His voice was desperate, raw, but no one answered. The building was dead silent, as if the world outside the elevator had ceased to exist. Then, with a loud screech, the elevator doors slid open, revealing nothing but a black void on the other side. Mark froze, staring into the abyss. It wasn't the floor he had come from. There were no lights, no walls, just an endless darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The whisper came again, this time from within the darkness. "Step forward, Mark. Come with me." His legs refused to move. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, but the pull of the void was relentless. He could feel the cold grip of something unseen tugging at him, dragging him closer to the edge. In a desperate act of defiance, Mark threw himself against the back of the elevator, refusing to step into the dark. But the void wasn't done with him. The shadowy figure appeared again, this time standing just outside the elevator. It extended a hand, long, thin, and unnaturally twisted, like a grotesque parody of a human limb. The air around it shimmered with darkness, and as it reached for him, Mark could feel his strength draining away. "Come. Now." The voice was hypnotic, pulling at his willpower, unraveling his resistance. But something deep inside Mark fought back. A primal instinct for survival surged through him, and with a desperate scream, he slammed his fist into the elevator control panel. The lights inside the elevator flickered back on with a jolt, and the doors slammed shut, cutting off the shadowy figure just as its hand brushed against Mark's arm. The elevator groaned and shuddered, and for a moment, everything was still. Mark collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His entire body was shaking, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He glanced at the control panel, praying that the elevator would start moving again. To his relief, it did. Slowly, the elevator descended, the hum of the machinery oddly comforting after the suffocating silence of the last few minutes. Mark didn't move from the floor, clutching his flashlight tightly in his hands. But he knew this wasn't over. Part 3. The Descent. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, the doors slid open with a soft chime. Mark scrambled to his feet, still shaking, and stumbled out into the lobby. The familiar surroundings did little to ease the fear that gnawed at him. Everything looked the same. The sterile, polished floors, the empty reception desk, the glass doors leading to the parking lot outside. But something was off. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the entity's presence still lingered, watching him. Mark made a beeline for the front doors. He needed to get out, to leave the building and never come back. He would quit his job tomorrow. No paycheck was worth this. But as he reached for the door handle, the voice returned. "You cannot escape." Mark froze, his hand hovering just inches from the door. His breath caught in his throat. The voice was louder now, more forceful, like it was inside his head, echoing off the walls of his mind. Slowly, he turned around. The lobby was empty, but the oppressive energy in the air was palpable. It pressed down on him like a weight, making it hard to breathe. And then he saw it. In the reflection of the glass doors, a figure stood behind him. The same shadowy entity from the elevator, its twisted form looming in the background, watching him with unseen eyes. Mark spun around, but the lobby was empty. His heart pounded, his skin prickling with fear. He was losing his mind, surely. But the voice wouldn't let him go. "You belong to me now, Mark." The door behind him wouldn't budge as he tried desperately to escape, but the entity's grip tightened, pulling him deeper into the darkness of its curse.